remain relatively light. That could now change, as the aircraft based here must now be prepared for the possibility of low-level and daylight missions.
There isn't a single sortie that is flown where these boys aren't absolutely ready and aware of the potential threat to them, which is sophisticated.
A point that air crews and senior officers will reiterate when George Robertson arrives here later today. The Defence Secretary visits the base just as the operation enters a decisive and far more risky second phase. And it's one in which the Harriers based here will play a decisive role. A military operation now firmly focused on striking at the root cause of the refugee crisis, which now threatens to engulf the region. James Forlong, Sky News, at the Gioia del Colle airbase, southern Italy.
The airstrikes took on...
Some live pictures coming in of B-52s returning to RAF Fairford. We saw them leaving earlier in the day, and there is a thought there that they may, I think you can see the pictures, that they have possibly been out on the latest round of assignments over the Balkans, but we'll find out that later when the USAF NATO briefs us. But it looks like according to what we're hearing, phase 2 is now starting to become apparent, which is a NATO effort to strike more at the Yugoslav ground troops or the Serbian police ground forces and so on. Do you see that as an encouraging sign that they're getting in closer to the people who are actually doing the damage on the ground in Kosovo itself?
Yes, and bluntly, they got there a bit faster than I thought they would. I thought it would take rather longer to take down the Yugoslav air defences. Let me tell you when I think we will know that phase 2 is clearly embarked, and we will begin to see the first effect of that on the operations on the ground in Kosovo. It's when we begin to undertake sorties and actions by daylight. Now, it's much more dangerous. You're firing this from close up to your target, not 100 miles away with a cruise missile. And of course, at this stage, you become a prey to handheld guided missiles. But sooner or later, that moment will have to arrive. And when it does, and I've seen the Serb army in operation, good gunners they are, good at camouflage and maneuver and being shot back at. They're very good at shooting at people. They're not much good at being shot back at. I think they'll be very, very significant and quite easy targets for fighter ground attack aircraft, perhaps even attack helicopters, in the phase that begins to operate during daylight hours. And we haven't seen that yet, though in due course I think we will.
Mr. Ashdown, you, as an ex-soldier, you feel it's inevitable that ground troops will have to be deployed to finish off this job if we're to do it properly.
Because I understand 4 took off.
Indeed, so that's the case. 4 took off this morning. Now, initially, we thought that they were making their way to the United States on a resupply mission, possibly to collect more cruise missiles. The timing of the return of this bomber, and the 3 which we believe will follow it in the next 15 minutes or so, indicates that that initial information was incorrect, and it's far more likely that they've been on a bombing run, and given that they have been away just under 7 hours, one would assume that certainly Kosovo was the place that they've been to.
And any official word on what they've been doing?
No, absolutely none. All the United States Air Force will say is that we have airplanes in the air, and they are carrying out the tasks designated to them by NATO. As you can imagine, that does cover everything from launching cruise missiles to relocating to another airfield for whatever reason, to collecting supplies, cruise missiles from America, or simply refueling wherever. But so, as you can imagine, on an operation like this, all details are kept classified and are not confirmed at all.
Air defences. For the first few nights, radar sites, airfields and missile batteries were attacked. That campaign continues, but now in phase 2, NATO has drawn a line across Yugoslavia to try to protect Kosovo. Any military presence south of this line, the 44th parallel, is liable to be attacked. The principal targets are the Yugoslav army, the Serbian special police and Serbian paramilitary groups. Unmanned surveillance aircraft like these used by NATO in Bosnia should be able to pinpoint those targets. They will also be used to gather evidence about war crimes. Then much will depend on this aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt of the US Air Force. It's slow and vulnerable, but extremely effective in dealing with armoured vehicles and ground forces. At NATO headquarters, officials accept that the Serb campaign is further advanced than NATO's.
we will have to catch up. We are throwing as much effort as we can into it. I can assure you that every military person in the NATO chain is very well aware of the urgency, and we are moving heaven and earth to try and get up to speed and get into there and to address the problem as quickly as we can.
More B-52 bombers arrived in Britain from America this evening. NATO knows that this operation is now a race against time with no guarantee of success. It knows too that for very many Kosovar Albanians it is already too late. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, as the NATO campaign has intensified, Serb
this afternoon, Mr. Robertson warned that the risks being taken by RAF pilots were increasing all the time.
Flying in to deliver praise and encouragement, the Defence Secretary and representatives from the Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties came to the RAF base in southern Italy to see the NATO operation at first hand. The politicians told the Harrier pilots they were proud of them. Then the Defence Secretary was given more details of last night's operation when a Harrier jet came under heavy anti-aircraft fire over Kosovo. The plane was also detected by Serbian surface-to-air missile systems. For almost an hour, George Robertson heard about the continuing danger of flying over enemy territory.
Well, there are clearly risks, but people who are brave and skilled and professional seem to take that in their strides. But it certainly would frighten most of us who don't have to experience that on a day-to-day basis.
There were warm words too for the RAF support personnel who helped to keep the whole operation going. But all here gained the impression that the attack on Serbian targets will continue for some time yet. Hopes of a short war are fading. Tonight, these Harriers may be flying again. The Defence Secretary knows that the Serbians have plenty of weapons left in their armoury. The Defence Secretary's visit has been much appreciated here, but the air crews will have left him in no doubt about the continuing dangers they face, despite the days of bombing supposed to disable Serbia's anti-aircraft capability. Jonathan Sherman.
Start of phase 2, a deliberate policy to attack Serb troops responsible for the massacres in Kosovo. The bombing over the last 5 days had been aimed at destroying military command centres. As ITN's Robert Moore reports, today's raids reflect the growing anxiety that airstrikes alone may not be able to finish the job.
Throughout the day, NATO warplanes have launched a series of combat missions from their Italian bases. F-16 and F-18 strike aircraft, as well as prowlers whose job it is to disable enemy radar, all took to the skies and headed for Yugoslavia. And warships such as the USS Philippine Sea sailing in the Adriatic have also fired more cruise missiles. But it's widely acknowledged that air power and missiles are not able to halt the atrocities. But the effort has now shifted to hitting the infrastructure supporting that repression.
The tempo of operations is getting faster, and the focus of our operations is shifting decisively towards actions against the forces implementing Milosevic's policy of repression in Kosovo.
One example, an ammunition facility in Kosovo was targeted by RAF Harriers last night. At a briefing, the pilot's raid was described as highly successful.
He's tracking the target continuously while he's manoeuvring away from the target, and you'll shortly see weapon impact. And there we have a very successful attack.
But one bomb did clearly miss its target, exploding on open ground.
There's the one that didn't impact properly, but the second weapon guided precisely onto the target, so that target was also destroyed.
But with so many of the atrocities being carried out by highly mobile paramilitary forces, it seems clear that NATO ground troops, not distant air power, will be required to halt the brutality. Into this complex military picture comes fresh diplomatic activity. A Russian team is flying to Belgrade tomorrow to try and mediate, headed by Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov. But there is still no sign that Yugoslavia will agree to the international peace plan on Kosovo. In the Commons, the Prime Minister dismissed charges that NATO actions had made the situation even worse. He said the bombing must now intensify.
For every act of barbarity, every slaughter of the innocent, Milosevic should be made to pay a higher and a higher price.
This evening, as America's giant B-52 bombers landed back in Britain after another mission, all the signs are of a growing air campaign. but one that is proving unable to halt the unfolding humanitarian tragedy. Robert Moore.
This nightly bombardment means NATO believes it has neutralized Serbia's air defences, and the cockpit videos from other aircraft, in this case British Harriers, show them now operating directly over Kosovo. This was an ammunition dump. NATO's targets are now clustered around Kosovo in a desperate race to halt Serb military forces in their campaign against Kosovo's Albanians.
There is a campaign.
A blaze of lightning momentarily shatters the darkened bridge of the U.S. guided missile destroyer Gonzales. The storm at sea showing up on radar like a sinister cloud. Military planners admit bad weather in the region has at times limited the effectiveness of the ongoing NATO strikes on Serb targets. And weather isn't the only problem. Smoke from fires burning in Kosovo is also interfering with NATO's use of laser-guided bombs.
But the Navy's latest version of the Tomahawk cruise missile, fired out of these launchers on deck here, are for the most part unfazed by either smoke or bad weather, since their targeting system relies not on vision, but on global positioning satellites to tell them where to go.
Information is downloaded from the satellite to the Tomahawk in flight. It corrects its flight path. And it leads it to its target. It's very precise.
Advancements in technology have done more than just make the Tomahawk an all-weather system. They have changed it from a strategic to a tactical weapon. The Navy's first use of the Tomahawk was during the Gulf War. Then, strikes had to be planned at the Pentagon level, often weeks in advance, due to the time it took to load the missile's older guidance system. As the recent quick-task daylight launches show in the Kosovo crisis, the time between when a target is spotted and fired on by a Tomahawk has been greatly reduced, bringing the decision-making level down from the Pentagon and putting it into the hands of local commanders closer to the conflict.
This battle group was designed with special internet capability in the classified and unclassified system so we can exchange data rapidly, much more different than in 1991 where they were trying to transmit everything by radio. We don't have to do that anymore.
In many ways, the Navy's newest version of the Tomahawk shares the old traditions of the U.S. mail service, undeterred by weather and very capable of delivering. Martin Savage, CNN, aboard the U.S. destroyer Gonzales in the Adriatic.
At the weekend, they ordered Phase 2, a shift towards bombing more of the units which are actually operating in Kosovo. The Yugoslav army has about 300 tanks, 400 field guns and 1,000 other armoured vehicles in the province. If NATO wanted to destroy, say, half of those targets, Gulf War experience suggests they'd need between 1,000 and 1,500 ground attack missions. So far, they've been flying only 20 to 30 each day. Either it's going to take a couple of months to make really deep inroads, or NATO needs to commit a whole lot more aircraft. Today, though, NATO appeared unable to provide any detail on promised further deployments.
On that to give you. We saw yesterday two countries, the US and the UK, announced that they were sending further aircraft. Other countries, I'm certain, will be doing that in the next few days, simply because in a rolling air campaign such as this, there is, of course, the need not only to have further specialized aircraft, but also rotation.
The reinforcements are coming, and we are getting some very good aircraft and support aircraft as well to help us to do our job.
So far, the 4 Harriers sent yesterday from Britain are the only firm reinforcements. The Americans are following, but others seem more reticent. President Clinton has spoken of degrading the Yugoslav forces, but how much...
Eugene Campbell on board as they fired off cruise missiles. Here's Norman Rees.
It's 10 o'clock at night in the Gloucestershire countryside, and on the flight deck of this American B-52, it's the final seconds before takeoff from RAF Fairford.
Unstick.
On board 6 fully armed cruise missiles, 5 hours away, target areas in Serbia and Kosovo. On the cockpit display, the outline of the other B-52 on the same mission. An ITN night-side camera captures the routine of the American crew charting the route to their assigned target. As the bombers near the target, the launch crew prepare the missiles. The B-52 leading the formation fires first.
We most likely are going to see the missiles. There's another one.
On board this B-52, the countdown to their launch begins.
Airspeed's good. Wings are level.
The atmosphere is businesslike, nothing to indicate that 6 missiles are launched in 6 minutes to targets more than 500 miles away, each missile costing $1.2 million.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Missile away.
In military terms, it's a complete success.
Tell them we're complete with launch.
Understand complete?
Yes.
Outstanding.
10 hours after takeoff, it's returned to base. 12,000 pounds of high explosive delivered to enemy targets, touchdown back at RAF Fairford. Norman Rees, ITN.
B bombers, not so much because it needs long-range bombers, but because the B-1B can deliver high-tech cluster bombs. The bomblets released are heat-seeking and especially effective against tanks and armored vehicles. That's what's needed if the accelerated Serb push in Kosovo is to be stopped.
In terms of can we catch up, we will have to catch up. We are throwing as much effort as we can into it.
To achieve that goal in Kosovo's rough terrain, military experts consider a tactic known as a kill box. It breaks the terrain down as in a grid and uses varied resources to take control of a limited area for a limited time. One scenario would bring in the B-1Bs and heavy bombers, the swift strikes of F-16 fighters, the low, slow, but deadly A-10 tank killers. The A-10s are a threat to the Serbs' mobility, their tanks and their armored vehicles. First, NATO forces, though, are concentrating on cutting off Serb supply lines.
The impact. The air campaign can succeed in its objectives, which are to force Milosevic to make peace or severely limit his ability to make war. CBS's David Martin has the latest now from the Pentagon.
The U.S. Navy launched cruise missiles at a target that until last night had been off limits because of the danger of hitting nearby civilians. But now NATO is racing to destroy the Serb military and police before they wipe out the Albanian population of Kosovo. So on the 5th night of airstrikes, NATO declared the Serb police headquarters in Kosovo fair game, even though it is located in the middle of a city. At the same time, British jets bombed an ammunition storage depot used by the police in Kosovo.
The NATO allies are together taking tough action to limit the capability of the Serb security forces to suppress the civilian population in Kosovo.
But NATO is starting to feel the strain. More B-52s had to be sent to England because the original supply of air-launched cruise missiles is all but exhausted. And there is no end in sight. More ships armed with sea-launched cruise missiles are on their way, and B-1 bombers, which can carry 84 500-pound bombs apiece, will begin operations later this week. NATO aircraft are hitting staging areas, supply depots, and ammo dumps, but are still not hitting Serb troops in the field.
This is not attacking individual tanks and artillery. That's going to take more time and better weather than we have right now. Night number 6 of airstrikes is now underway. The weather is bad and forecast to remain that way for the next 2 or 3 days. That will probably slow down operations in what has become a grim contest to see if NATO can keep bombing longer than the Serb army can keep killing. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon. Saying little about the weekend crash of an F-117A stealth fighter in Serbia or about the rescue of the pilot. CBS News senior European correspondent Tom Fenton has been digging for details on the heroic effort to get the American airmen back to home base in Aviano, Italy.
Late Saturday night, minutes after the stealth fighter went down, an extraordinary search and rescue operation started up. The plane was destroyed, but the pilot was alive, somewhere deep in enemy territory. With the Serb manhunt underway, the race was on to find a single man in the middle of the night. Homing in on the pilot's emergency signal, helicopters with special operations teams on board raced towards a spot west of Belgrade. As seen in this training video, the unit is prepared to do it all. Fight its way in, administer first aid, and get their guy home alive. What you can't see is the danger and daring. Former unit member John Smith.
You rely on speed and violence of action to get in quickly, find your survivor, recover him, authenticate him, and get him out of there.
As the mission unfolded on the ground, Allied planes circled above. On board this C-130, tension rose as the crew watched and waited. When the good news came, professional cool gave way to celebration.
The excitement inside, it was deafening. Everybody was cheering and clapping. We finally were able to see the end of our job.
And the stakes could not have been higher. In past wars, captured pilots have become tools of enemy propaganda, or names added to the lists of the missing and dead.
Forces as NATO intensifies its campaign to stop what it calls ethnic re-engineering by Serbs. At the Pentagon, spokesman Kent Bacon says the bombing campaign is taking a toll on the Yugoslav army. He insists
Serbs' alleged attacks on ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, the U.S. Air Force has added one more plane to the mix. It's sending 5 B-1B bombers, not so much because it needs long-range bombers, but because the B-1B can deliver high-tech cluster bombs. The bomblets released are heat-seeking and especially effective against tanks and armored vehicles. That's what's needed if the accelerated Serb push in Kosovo is to be stopped.
In terms of can we catch up, we will have to catch up. We are throwing as much effort as we can into it.
To achieve that goal in Kosovo's rough terrain, military experts consider a tactic known as a kill box. It breaks the terrain down as in a grid and uses varied resources to take control of a limited area for a limited time. One scenario would bring in the B-1Bs and heavy bombers, the swift strikes of F-16 fighters, the low, slow, but deadly A-10 tank killers. The A-10s are a threat to the Serbs' mobility, their tanks and their armored vehicles. First, NATO forces, though, are concentrating on cutting off Serb supply lines.
The impact.
So mighty and self-confident, the plan was for this overwhelming air power to bomb the Serbs to the peace table and to save the Kosovo Albanians. But nearly 1 week on, no one knows if the bombers will be enough. Even the first phase, destroying the Serbs' air defences, has been easier to plan than to carry out. Airfields, radars and the troops that support them have all been targets, and NATO says it is on course. But the bombing has clearly achieved less than NATO wanted to by this stage in the campaign. The bad weather is blamed, and the result is that even now, NATO cannot be sure the skies are safe.
They have taken out a lot of the Serbian air defense capability, but it's well integrated, which means that it can be sort of reconstructed after some damage. So there is a lot of redundancy in that system, and as a result of that, you'll never make the skies completely safe while there's almost anything there, and there is still quite a lot there.
So phase 2, underway now, hitting Serb forces in Kosovo, is the most hazardous and the least certain. Nearly all last night's air attacks were inside Kosovo. RAF Harriers struck at ammunition stores there, for example. But the key elements, the tanks, guns and soldiers, are easy to hide. They can be placed among houses, so NATO risks killing civilians. There's also the possibility that Kosovo Albanians will be used as human shields, yet another restraint on the use of air power. All this raises questions about whether the airstrikes alone can stop the ethnic cleansing, and what NATO should do if they don't. Already some influential figures say a huge force of troops should be readied for action.
If Mr. Milosevic was convinced that that is an option that we might exercise, I think it could lend impetus to convincing him that he cannot win and that we will not allow him to win. We are a superior power, and we must win this conflict with whatever it takes.
A NATO ground force is in position near the Kosovo border, not to fight its way in, but to police a peace deal if one comes about. Public pressure could change that, though, if demands grow to do more to save the Kosovo Albanians. That would require a far bigger force than this, months to build it up, and for
which I have to say I have absolutely no independent confirmation, is of a large number of refugees being attacked by artillery and tanks in the Perugia Valley. And of course, the Perugia Valley is in the vicinity of Arasovac. I will seek further confirmation and give you more details tomorrow. I will leave Jamie to give you more details of the humanitarian situation on the ground. Turning to our air operations yesterday, we attacked targets in these locations, in the Fry and in Kosovo. And we have good initial evidence of our success. Despite poor weather, we are managing to attack Serbian military and MUP assets, and in particular, we are stepping up our interdiction against their field forces in Kosovo. Before leaving this slide, I would like to bring up an important point. Each of the triangles that you see on the map represents an area where numerous targets or aim points will have been struck. We will continue to plan vigorously to maintain and, where possible, increase the intensity of these operations over the coming days. Last night, SAM activity remained relatively low, but we cannot underestimate the remaining effectiveness of the integrated air defense system. We are detecting a very well orchestrated and dynamic tactical air defense campaign against us. However, to our advantage, the complications and mobility that the FRY is forced to introduce into its system leads to the disruption and degradation of the effectiveness of its application. I can reiterate that, thankfully, we had no losses yesterday, and we were not offered the opportunity to engage any aircraft from the FRY. Let me now show you some imagery of some of our recent attacks. The film clips that you are about to see are of a recent attack on the large MUP headquarters complex in Pristina. It is a large complex. The whole image you are about to see represents just one part of this extensive complex. Each clip depicts aircraft targeting different impact points on the facility. You will also notice secondary explosions resulting from the attack.
Crisis in Kosovo as a modern-day Great Terror. These are today's main developments.
Yugoslavia's President Milosevic says he's ready for peace, but that troop levels in Kosovo will be reduced only after NATO stops its campaign.